The autumn rain hammered against the windshield as Grace Donovan pulled her Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot of Crystal Caverns State Park in Kentucky. October 17, 2018, a Wednesday afternoon that should have been ordinary. The 43-year-old high school biology teacher from Louisville had driven 3 hours east to explore the labyrinthine cave system she'd studied for months, planning to incorporate first-hand observations into her geology unit. Her students at Jefferson High had been buzzing with excitement when she mentioned the trip during Monday's class, showing them photos of the massive underground chambers and delicate mineral formations. Grace had promised to bring back samples and stories that would make the textbook diagrams come alive. The parking lot stood nearly empty, just 2 other vehicles huddled near the visitor center. Grace checked her phone, 2:47 p.m. The last guided tour had departed at 2 o'clock, but she'd obtained a special permit for solo exploration of the less-traveled eastern passages, areas closed to general tourists. As an experienced caver with over 15 years of spelunking across Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, she'd navigated more challenging systems than this. Her backpack held the essentials: headlamp with spare batteries, water bottles, granola bars, a first aid kit, rope, and her weathered field journal. She locked the car, pocketed her keys, and approached the cave entrance, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees within the first 20 feet. Before we continue Grace's journey, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It really helps us share more incredible stories like this one. Now, let's follow Grace into the darkness that would change everything. The cave swallowed her whole. Grace descended the aluminum staircase installed by the Park Service, her headlamp beam cutting through the blackness like a knife through velvet. The main chamber opened up around her, a cathedral of stone where centuries of water had carved Gothic arches and columns from the limestone. She paused to photograph a particularly striking flowstone formation, its rippled surface resembling frozen waterfalls. The silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water finding its patient way through rock. According to her permit and the geological survey map she'd studied, the Eastern Passage network extended nearly 4 miles into the mountain, with vertical drops connecting 3 distinct levels. She planned to explore the middle tier, where recent surveys had documented rare helictite formations, those gravity-defying mineral projections that seemed to grow sideways and upward, defying all logic. 2 hours into her exploration, Grace had filled 7 pages of her journal with sketches and observations. She'd photographed crystal clusters that would make her students gasp, documented water pH levels in 3 different underground pools, and collected small samples of various mineral deposits in labeled plastic bags. The passages had narrowed considerably, requiring her to navigate on hands and knees through sections where the ceiling pressed down to barely 3 feet of clearance. Her knees ached despite the padding, and limestone dust coated her jacket and cargo pants. She checked her watch. 4:52 p.m. Time to start heading back. She'd planned to be above ground before full darkness fell outside. Grace turned in the confined space, orienting herself toward the return route. That's when she heard it, a low, grinding rumble that seemed to come from the stone itself. The sound intensified, and Grace's headlamp flickered as vibrations shook loose centuries of settled dust. Earthquake. Her mind raced through the geology. The New Madrid seismic zone wasn't far from here, a fault system capable of devastating tremors. She pressed herself against the passage wall as chunks of limestone began falling from the ceiling. A piece the size of a dinner plate struck her shoulder, and she cried out, scrambling forward even as larger sections of rock rained down. The grinding became a roar. 30 feet ahead, where the passage widened into a connecting chamber, the ceiling collapsed in a thunderous cascade. Grace covered her head with her arms as the shock wave of displaced air and pulverized stone washed over her. Then, as suddenly as it began, the earthquake stopped. The silence that followed felt absolute, oppressive, a living thing pressing against her chest. She lay still for several minutes, testing her limbs. The shoulder throbbed, but moved normally, bruised, not broken. Her headlamp had survived the impact, its beam now cutting through a fog of suspended limestone dust. Grace coughed, tasting minerals and earth. When the dust began to settle, she crawled forward to assess the damage. What she found made her stomach drop into free fall. The passage ahead, her only route back to the surface, had been completely sealed by tons of collapsed rock. Massive limestone slabs, some weighing hundreds of pounds, had wedged together in a chaotic puzzle that extended far beyond what her light could penetrate. She placed her hands against the nearest boulder and pushed experimentally. It didn't budge even a fraction of an inch. The realization crashed over her like the rockfall itself. She was trapped 4 miles deep in a mountain, in a section of cave that wouldn't see another permitted visitor for months. Grace forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. 15 years of caving experience had prepared her for emergencies, taught her that survival depended on clear thinking and systematic problem-solving. She retreated 20 feet from the collapse and sat down, back against the stone wall, to take inventory. Her backpack had protected most of its contents during the rockfall. She laid everything out on the cave floor, cataloguing her resources with the same methodical approach she used to organize lab equipment for her students. The headlamp worked, but 2 of her 3 spare battery packs had been crushed. 1 water bottle had cracked and leaked completely. The other held perhaps 20 ounces, 6 granola bars, her planned snacks for the drive home. The first aid kit, rope, her phone showing no signal and only 48% battery, the field journal, a pen, and the mineral samples she'd collected. This was everything standing between her and death in the absolute darkness of the earth. She powered off her headlamp to conserve batteries, plunging herself into a blackness so complete it seemed to have texture and weight. In the darkness, Grace allowed herself 60 seconds to feel the fear, to acknowledge the probability that she might die here in this tomb of stone. She thought of her daughter, Lily, a college freshman at the University of Kentucky, who'd hugged her tight before she left that morning. She thought of her classroom, of the lesson plans waiting on her desk, of the students who would wonder where their favorite teacher had gone. Then she forced those thoughts aside and turned her analytical mind to the problem at hand. The collapse blocked the route she knew, but caves were 3-dimensional labyrinths. Water had created this system over millions of years, finding countless pathways through the limestone. If water could find a way, perhaps she could too. Grace switched her headlamp back on and began exploring the passages that branched away from her current position. She'd been so focused on her planned route that she hadn't paid close attention to the side tunnels. Now they represented her only hope. She marked her starting point by stacking 3 fist-sized rocks in a distinctive cairn, then used a fragment of limestone to scratch an arrow on the wall, pointing back toward this location. If she was going to search for an alternative route to the surface, she needed to ensure she wouldn't get lost in the process. The irony struck her. Trapped and lost were 2 different flavors of doom, and she was determined to avoid both. She rationed 1 granola bar and 3 sips of water, then set off into the unknown passages, leaving chalk marks on the walls at every intersection, a trail of breadcrumbs through the underworld. The first passage descended sharply, the floor slick with moisture. Grace moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing her weight. The passage opened into a chamber she'd never seen on any survey map, a circular room, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling that soared beyond her light's reach. The walls glistened with moisture, and she could hear water running somewhere in the darkness below. Following the sound, she discovered a small stream emerging from a crack in the wall and disappearing into a crevasse barely 8 inches wide. She knelt beside it, cupping her hand to taste the water. Cold, clean, with the mineral tang of limestone filtration. This was critical. She'd found a water source. The single remaining bottle wouldn't have lasted more than 2 days, but this stream could sustain her indefinitely. She refilled her bottle, feeling the first small spark of hope since the collapse. Water meant survival. Water meant time. Time meant someone might eventually find her if the park service noticed her car still sitting in the parking lot, if they mounted a search, if they could determine where in this vast underground system she might be trapped. Days blurred together in the darkness. Grace had no natural light to mark the passage of time, relying on her watch to maintain a routine that kept her anchored to sanity. She established a base camp in the chamber with the water source, returning there after each exploration session to rest and preserve her energy. The granola bars ran out on day 4. By day 5, the gnawing hunger became a constant companion, a physical ache that made her limbs feel heavy and her thoughts sluggish. She'd rationed carefully, splitting each bar into smaller portions, but 6 granola bars couldn't sustain a human body for long. The water kept her alive, but provided no calories, no fuel for the body slowly consuming itself. On day 7, Grace made a decision that felt both desperate and necessary. She began using her chalk, the white limestone fragments she'd been marking trails with, as a crude map-making tool. The cave walls became her canvas, and she sketched an evolving diagram of every passage she explored, every dead end she encountered, every promising route that ultimately led nowhere. Her teacher's instinct for visual organization served her well. The map grew more complex each day, covering a 10-foot section of wall in her base chamber. She labeled chambers with letters, passages with numbers, marked water sources with wavy lines and areas of instability with warning symbols. It became more than navigation, it became meditation, a way to impose order on the chaos of her situation, to transform victim into scientist, trapped animal into methodical explorer. The hunger evolved from sharp pain to a hollow numbness. Grace's stomach had stopped demanding food, her body shifting into starvation mode, hoarding every calorie of stored fat and eventually breaking down muscle tissue for fuel. She grew weaker daily, her movements slower and more deliberate. Climbing over boulder fields that she'd navigated easily in the first days now required rest breaks every few minutes. Her headlamp batteries died on day 9, plunging her into permanent darkness, except for the brief periods when she used her phone's flashlight to work on the wall map. She conserved the phone battery obsessively, allowing herself only 10 minutes of light per day. The rest of the time, she navigated by touch and memory, trailing her fingers along walls, counting paces, using the sound of dripping water and the feel of air currents to orient herself in the blackness. By day 12, Grace had explored every accessible passage within half a mile of her base camp. All of them terminated in dead ends, squeezes too tight for a human body, or drops too steep to descend without proper climbing gear. The despair threatened to overwhelm her during these long hours of darkness. She talked to herself constantly, holding conversations with imaginary companions to fight off the disorientation that came with sensory deprivation. She recited lessons from her classroom, explaining photosynthesis and cellular respiration to students who existed only in her mind. She sang every song she could remember from her daughter's childhood, lullabies and Disney ballads echoing off stone walls that had never heard a human voice before her arrival. The psychological challenges proved more dangerous than the physical ones. On day 14, Grace experienced her first hallucination, believing she saw sunlight streaming through a crack in the ceiling, scrambling toward it, only to have her reaching fingers meet solid stone. The realization that her mind was beginning to fracture frightened her more than the hunger or the darkness. She instituted a new routine. 3 times each day, she would recite specific facts about her identity and situation, anchoring herself to reality. My name is Grace Donovan. I'm 43 years old. I teach biology at Jefferson High School in Louisville. I have a daughter named Lily who is 18. Today is October 31st, 2018. I've been trapped for 14 days. I'm in Crystal Caverns in eastern Kentucky. People are looking for me. I will survive this. The mantra became a lifeline, words worn smooth like river stones from constant repetition. On day 16, weakness forced her to abandon active exploration. Grace could no longer safely navigate the treacherous passages, her muscles too depleted, her coordination too compromised. She spent the hours lying beside the underground stream, drifting in and out of a twilight state between waking and sleeping. In these fever dreams, she taught elaborate lessons to phantom students, graded invisible papers, attended faculty meetings in chambers of stone. The boundary between reality and hallucination grew porous, and Grace found herself losing track of which experiences were real and which were products of her starving brain. But even in this deteriorated state, the teacher's mind continued working. Grace realized that the stream, her water source and anchor point, had to flow somewhere. Water always found the lowest route, following gravity's inexorable pull. She'd been thinking like a human, looking for horizontal passages that would lead back to familiar territory. But water thought vertically. If she could follow this stream to wherever it led, it might connect to a lower level of the cave system, perhaps one with another exit, or at least with passages that intersected with more frequently traveled routes. The plan required strength she no longer possessed, but it offered something she desperately needed: purpose. On day 17, after sleeping for what felt like half a day, Grace began preparing for what she knew would be her last exploration attempt. She tore pages from her field journal and used the pen to write a detailed message explaining what had happened, her current location as best she could determine, and the route she planned to take following the stream. She placed the pages in a plastic bag from her first aid kit and wedged it into a crack in the wall beside her chalk map, above the flood line where any water surge wouldn't wash it away. If she died in the attempt to follow the stream, at least there would be a record, evidence that might help future cavers understand this section of the system. Grace used her phone's flashlight for one last look at the map she'd created, committing it to memory. Then she powered the phone off completely, saving the remaining battery for absolute emergency. She filled her water bottle one final time, said goodbye to the chamber that had been her home for more than 2 weeks, and began following the stream into the unknown. The passage narrowed as Grace crawled through darkness, following the sound and feel of flowing water. Without light, she navigated by touch and instinct, her fingers tracing the stream's path as it cut through increasingly tight confines. The limestone grew slick and treacherous, coated with algae and bacterial films that thrived in the eternal darkness. Several times she nearly lost her grip on the slippery rock, catching herself just before sliding into what sounded like a significant drop. The stream's murmur had grown louder, suggesting larger volumes of water ahead. A waterfall, perhaps, or a deep pool where multiple flows converged. After what her exhausted body told her must be hours of crawling, the passage opened abruptly. Grace felt the change in air pressure against her face, the way sound echoed differently in a larger space. She'd emerged into another chamber. Using precious phone battery, she allowed herself 30 seconds of light. The chamber was massive, easily 100 feet across, with multiple waterfalls cascading from openings high in the walls. The streams converged into a pool that filled perhaps a third of the floor space before draining through a series of cracks too small to follow. But along the far wall, Grace's light revealed something that made her heart race. Aluminum rungs bolted into the stone, leading upward into darkness. A ladder, installed by cavers or researchers at some point, marking a route to somewhere. The discovery flooded her system with adrenaline, overriding the weakness of starvation for brief, precious minutes. Grace stumbled around the pool's edge toward the ladder, her legs trembling with effort. She grabbed the lowest rung and pulled herself up, testing whether her depleted muscles could manage the climb. Pain shot through her arms and shoulders, but the rungs held firm. She climbed in darkness, counting each rung to track her progress. 20 rungs, 40, 60. Her arms burned and her grip faltered multiple times, but she forced herself upward through pure determination. At 93 rungs, her reaching hand found stone instead of metal. She'd reached the top of the ladder, pulling herself over the lip of what felt like a vertical shaft onto a blessedly horizontal surface. Grace lay gasping on the stone floor, every muscle quivering with exhaustion. When her breathing steadied, she allowed herself another brief burst of phone light. This new passage showed different characteristics than those she'd been navigating. The walls bore chisel marks and drilling scars, evidence of human modification. This was a section that had been actively explored and documented. Fresh hope surged through her. Modified passages meant regular visitors, meant established routes, meant possible salvation. She followed the passage in darkness, moving slowly and carefully, until she detected something that made her stop dead, a faint stirring of air against her face. Air movement meant connection to the surface, meant ventilation, meant the possibility of an exit somewhere ahead. The passage sloped upward, a gentle but steady incline that Grace climbed on hands and knees, conserving energy for the endless ascent. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. She would crawl for what felt like hours, rest when her body absolutely demanded it, then force herself to continue upward. The air current grew stronger, and she began to smell something besides mineral-laden stone. Organic decay, the musk of bat guano, scents that meant an ecosystem connected to the outside world. Animals required entrances and exits. Where bats could fly, perhaps a human could climb. On what her watch later revealed was day 21, Grace saw something she'd begun to believe she would never experience again. Light. Not the artificial glow of her headlamp or phone, but genuine natural light filtering through stone. She crawled faster, ignoring her body's protests, until she reached the source, a vertical shaft perhaps 8 feet in diameter, with daylight streaming down from an opening far above. The shaft's walls were rough limestone, studded with handholds and ledges. Clinging to the wall about 15 feet up was a cluster of bats, their small bodies silhouetted against the distant circle of sky. Grace estimated the shaft at roughly 60 feet deep. Under normal circumstances, an easy climb for someone with her experience. In her current state, starved and weakened, it might as well have been Everest. She sat at the base of the shaft, staring up at the circle of blue sky and white clouds drifting past. Freedom was 60 feet away. She'd found a way out. But finding and reaching were two entirely different challenges. Grace forced herself to eat, not food, which she didn't have, but water, filling her stomach with as much liquid as she could hold from a small seep running down the shaft wall. The water would provide some energy, some hydration to fuel the climb. She used her rope to create a makeshift harness around her waist, tying it with the bowline knot she'd taught to countless students during outdoor education units. If she fell during the climb, the rope might catch on a projection and arrest her descent. It was a slim hope, but better than nothing. Grace began to climb. Each handhold required conscious effort to maintain grip strength. Each foothold had to be tested carefully before trusting it with her weight. She climbed in small increments, moving up a few feet, then resting, clinging to the wall like one of the bats she'd disturbed into flight. At 20 feet, her left hand slipped and she swung out, catching herself with her right arm while her feet scrambled for purchase. At 30 feet, she had to stop and vomit, her body rejecting the large volume of water on an empty stomach. The vomiting left her even weaker, but she couldn't afford to descend. The only direction was up. At 40 feet, she entered a zone of pure determination. her mind divorced from her body's suffering, focused entirely on the next handhold, the next foothold, the mechanics of upward progress. At 50 feet, she could feel genuine warmth from the sunlight above. At 55 feet, she heard a sound that made her weep, a bird singing somewhere beyond the shaft opening. At 60 feet, Grace Donovan pulled herself over the lip of the opening and collapsed onto leaf-covered ground in the glorious, overwhelming sunshine of a November afternoon. She'd emerged from a sinkhole on a wooded hillside, miles from the main park entrance. She'd survived 22 days in absolute darkness, sustained by cave water and the determination that had made her an exceptional teacher. The refusal to give up on difficult problems, the patience to work through challenges step by methodical step. Grace lay in the fallen leaves for several minutes, simply breathing fresh air and feeling sunlight on her skin. The November weather was cold, probably in the mid-40s, but after weeks in the cave's constant 54-degree environment, the temperature felt perfect. When she finally trusted her legs to support her, she stood and assessed her surroundings. The forest was dense hardwood, oak and hickory mostly, with their leaves turning the browns and golds of late autumn. No trails were visible, no signs of human activity. She had no idea which direction might lead to roads or civilization. The sun told her it was mid-afternoon, and the position suggested she was looking roughly west. Grace knew the park's main entrance was on the western side of the protected area. Walking toward the sun would take her in the right general direction. She began walking, moving slowly through the forest, stopping frequently to rest. Her body was in catastrophic condition. She estimated she'd lost at least 30 pounds, her muscles had atrophied significantly, and she was profoundly dehydrated despite the cave water. Every step required conscious effort, and several times she stumbled over roots or uneven ground, her coordination compromised by prolonged darkness and malnutrition. But she was moving forward, and that was what mattered. After what she estimated was an hour of walking, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Traffic. The distant hum of vehicles on pavement meant a road ahead. Grace pushed through the last stretch of forest and emerged onto a 2-lane highway cutting through the hills. A green sign indicated she was on Route 715, 6 miles from the town of Pineville. She stood at the roadside, a gaunt figure in filthy, torn clothing, and began waving at approaching vehicles. The third car, a blue Ford pickup, pulled over. The driver, a man in his 60s with weathered hands and a concerned expression, rolled down his window and stared at her with undisguised shock. "Ma'am, are you all right? What happened to you?" Grace's voice came out as a croak, her throat raw from disuse and dehydration. "I need help. I was trapped in crystal caverns. I need to get to a hospital." The man's eyes widened. "Crystal caverns? That's been all over the news. They've had search teams looking for a missing teacher for 3 weeks. Are you Grace Donovan?" When she nodded, he immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The next hours unfolded in a blur of emergency response. An ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, paramedics surrounding her with blankets and starting an IV even before loading her onto the stretcher. During the 30-minute ride to Pineville Community Hospital, they peppered her with questions about her condition while monitoring her vital signs. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, her heart rate irregular, her body temperature below normal. She was severely dehydrated and suffering from acute starvation, her body cannibalizing its own tissues for fuel. At the hospital, a team of physicians took over, admitting her to the ICU for monitoring and treatment. The refeeding process would be slow and carefully managed. Giving a starvation victim too much food too quickly could trigger potentially fatal complications as the body struggled to process nutrients after prolonged deprivation. Word of her emergence spread rapidly. Within 2 hours, the hospital was fielding calls from news media across the region. The story of the biology teacher who'd survived 22 days trapped in a cave system captivated people's imagination. Grace's daughter Lily arrived that evening, having driven from Lexington the moment she received the call. Their reunion in the hospital room left both of them sobbing, Lily's hands gripping her mother's as if she might disappear again if her daughter let go. "I knew you were alive," Lily kept saying through tears. "Everyone said to prepare myself, but I knew you wouldn't give up. I knew you'd find a way." Grace held her daughter and felt something she doubted she would ever experience again. Complete safety, the certainty of survival, the warmth of love. The physicians were amazed by her condition. Yes, she was severely compromised, but she'd survived longer than most people could have in similar circumstances. Her decision to conserve energy, to establish a base camp near water, to maintain mental routines that prevented psychological collapse, all of these had been critical to her survival. Dr. Patel, the emergency medicine specialist overseeing her care, visited her room on the second day of hospitalization. "You understand that you should have died in there, right? 22 days with no food, in complete darkness, in a hypothermic environment. The odds were astronomically against you." Grace managed a weak smile. "I teach biology, Dr. Patel. I know exactly how the human body works and how close I came to complete system failure. But I also know how stubborn the human will to survive can be, and I had reasons to come back. My daughter, my students, my life." The Park Service launched a formal investigation into the incident. Rangers interviewed Grace extensively about her route, the location of the collapse, and the alternative passages she'd navigated. Her chalk map, still on the wall of her base camp chamber, became a crucial piece of evidence documenting previously unknown sections of the cave system. A recovery team eventually located her original entrance point and confirmed that the earthquake, a magnitude 4.2 tremor centered 12 miles away, had triggered a catastrophic collapse that would have required weeks of excavation to clear. If she'd waited for rescue at that location, she would have died long before anyone could have reached her. Her decision to explore alternative routes, though desperate, had saved her life. Physical recovery was measured in weeks and months. Grace spent 8 days in the hospital as physicians slowly reintroduced nutrition and monitored for refeeding syndrome. Her body weight had dropped from 142 pounds to 109, representing a loss of more than 20% of her body mass. Much of that was muscle tissue, which would require months of physical therapy and proper nutrition to rebuild. She experienced ongoing complications, nerve damage in her fingers from the cold and repetitive crawling, persistent digestive issues as her system relearned how to process food, and sleep disruption as her circadian rhythms recalibrated after 3 weeks of constant darkness. The psychological recovery proved more complex than the physical healing. Grace experienced vivid nightmares about being trapped in collapsing passages, waking in her hospital room disoriented and gasping for air. She developed a phobia of enclosed spaces. Even her hospital room felt too confining, and she insisted on keeping the door open and lights on at all times. Dr. Chen, the trauma psychologist assigned to her case, explained that these reactions were normal responses to an extraordinary trauma. You survived something that would have broken most people. Your brain is still processing the threat, still trying to protect you from dangers that no longer exist. This is the work we'll do together, helping your nervous system understand that you're safe now. News coverage of her ordeal was intense, but generally respectful. Grace gave one press conference from her hospital bed, mainly to thank the search and rescue teams who'd spent weeks looking for her in the wrong sections of the cave system. She deflected questions about heroism or courage. "I'm not a hero. I'm a biology teacher who got trapped and refused to quit. Everything I did in that cave was simple problem solving. Identify the challenge, inventory your resources, work through potential solutions methodically. That's the same process I teach my students every day in the lab. The only difference was that the stakes were higher than a grade on an exam. The humility struck a chord with people. Within days, her story had been picked up by national news outlets, and she received hundreds of letters from well-wishers, students, and fellow teachers. Jefferson High School planned a welcome-back celebration, but Grace requested something low-key. She wasn't ready for crowds or attention. Instead, she met with her students in small groups, answering their questions about the cave, the survival techniques, and how she'd maintained hope. The conversations became impromptu lessons in biology, geology, and psychology. Your body can survive about 3 weeks without food, she explained to one group of wide-eyed freshmen, but only 3 days without water. Finding that underground stream saved my life. That was the most critical factor in my survival. Everything else was secondary to securing a reliable water source. She showed them her scarred hands, the fingers still healing from countless scrapes and cuts. Every mark tells a story about navigating in darkness, about feeling my way through passages, about the price of refusing to quit. By late January 2019, 3 months after her rescue, Grace had recovered enough to return to limited teaching duties. She couldn't handle a full schedule yet, the physical demands of being on her feet for hours, the emotional energy required to manage classes of teenagers, but she taught 2 periods per day, gradually rebuilding her stamina. Her students treated her differently now, with a mixture of respect and careful concern, as if she might be fragile. Grace found this simultaneously touching and frustrating. She was changed by the experience, certainly, but she was still fundamentally the same person who'd entered that cave in October. The trauma hadn't destroyed her core identity. If anything, it had reinforced her understanding of her own resilience. The cave itself became a subject of renewed scientific interest. Grace's accidental exploration of previously undocumented passages provided valuable data for the geological survey teams studying the region's karst topography. The Park Service invited her to consult on their updated cave maps, incorporating the routes she'd navigated and the features she'd observed. She found the work therapeutic, transforming her desperate survival journey into useful scientific knowledge, giving meaning to the suffering. The vertical shaft she'd climbed to escape was now marked on official maps as Donovan's Exit, a designation that made her uncomfortable but which the surveyors insisted was appropriate. You discovered it, you documented it, you climbed it when most people would have died trying. It deserves to bear your name, the lead surveyor told her. Spring brought cherry blossoms and warm weather, and a growing sense that Grace needed to confront the cave directly. She'd been avoiding even thinking about crystal caverns in any context beyond clinical discussions with the survey team. But Dr. Chen suggested that returning to the location on her own terms and in controlled conditions might help her brain recontextualize the trauma. Right now, your nervous system associates caves with mortal danger. That's keeping you hypervigilant and preventing full recovery. If you can visit the cave with proper support, experiencing it as a place you survived rather than a place where you nearly died, it might help close that psychological wound. In early April, Grace arranged a private visit to Crystal Caverns accompanied by Lily, Dr. Chen, and a park ranger named Tom Blackwood, who'd been part of the original search effort. They didn't enter the cave itself. Grace wasn't ready for that. But they visited the sinkhole she'd emerged from, the exit that had represented salvation on that November afternoon. Standing at the edge of the opening, looking down into the shaft she'd climbed in her starved and weakened state, Grace felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride that she'd accomplished something extraordinary, gratitude for the second chance at life, but also closure, an acknowledgement that this chapter was ending, that she could begin thinking about her future rather than remaining imprisoned by her past. "I'm going to keep teaching," she told Lily as they walked back to the car. "Not just until retirement, I mean really teaching the way I did before. This experience gave me insights about resilience and problem solving that I need to share with my students. Every one of them will face their own version of being trapped in darkness at some point in their lives. Maybe not literally in a cave, but figuratively. Situations that seem impossible, challenges that appear insurmountable. I want to teach them what I learned, that you can survive if you refuse to panic, if you work the problem systematically, if you never quit, even when quitting seems like the only rational option." Lily squeezed her mother's hand. "You know that a bunch of them already call you the teacher who wouldn't quit, right? You've become kind of legendary." By the fall of 2019, 1 year after the incident, Grace had fully returned to her regular teaching schedule at Jefferson High. The physical recovery was essentially complete. She'd regained most of the lost muscle mass through dedicated physical therapy, and her weight had stabilized at a healthy 138 pounds. The psychological healing continued to progress, though she still experienced occasional nightmares and struggled with enclosed spaces. She'd learned to manage the symptoms, to recognize when her nervous system was overreacting to perceived threats, to use breathing techniques and cognitive strategies Dr. Chen had taught her. Her classroom had become something of a shrine to the cave experience, though Grace tried to keep it educational rather than sensational. One wall featured a large-scale map of crystal caverns, with her routes marked in different colors: blue for the initial exploration, red for the path blocked by collapse, green for the desperate search for alternative passages, and gold for the final escape route. Students could trace her journey, understanding the geography of her ordeal. Another display showed the actual contents of her backpack, the items that had sustained her: the battered water bottle, the rope harness, the nearly depleted first aid kit, and her field journal with its increasingly shaky handwriting documenting the progression of starvation and exhaustion. The journal had become particularly valuable for her teaching. Grace used excerpts during units on human physiology, showing students her documented observations of how the body responded to extreme caloric restriction. Day 7. Hand shaking during fine motor tasks. Day 11, muscle cramps in calves and thighs, likely electrolyte imbalance. Day 15, difficulty maintaining focus, experiencing memory gaps and temporal disorientation. The clinical observations made the abstract concepts in their textbooks visceral and real. Students stopped seeing metabolism and homeostasis as boring vocabulary terms, and started understanding them as life or death systems that had kept their teacher alive against impossible odds. Grace also spoke to student groups beyond her own classes. She gave presentations to the school's outdoor adventure club about wilderness survival and cave safety. She talked to the psychology classes about trauma response and resilience. She met with students struggling with depression or anxiety, sharing insights about maintaining hope in darkness. One conversation with a junior named Alex particularly moved her. Alex had been dealing with severe depression, feeling trapped in darkness that seemed permanent and inescapable. "How did you keep from just giving up?" Alex asked during a private meeting. "When you knew the odds were against you, when you were alone in the dark with no guarantee anyone would find you, what made you keep trying?" Grace thought carefully before answering. "I won't lie to you, Alex. There were moments I wanted to give up, moments when dying seemed easier than continuing to fight, but I had people I loved who needed me to survive. My daughter, my students. And I had a fundamental belief that problems have solutions, even when we can't immediately see what those solutions are. In the cave, the solution wasn't where I expected it to be, so I had to look elsewhere. I had to be flexible and creative and persistent. Your situation isn't the same as mine, but the principle applies. When one approach isn't working, we try different approaches. We keep searching for the passage that leads toward light. The conversation with Alex crystallized something Grace had been thinking about for months. She wanted to write a book about her experience, but not the sensational survivor's tale that publishers kept requesting. She wanted to write something useful, something that connected her cave ordeal to the everyday challenges students faced. Over the 2019 Christmas break, she began outlining what would eventually become Teaching in the Dark, lessons on resilience, problem-solving, and hope from 22 days underground. The book interweaved her survival story with practical strategies for dealing with adversity, aimed at young adults navigating their own difficult passages. Writing the book forced Grace to revisit details she'd tried to forget. The hallucinations on day 14, the moment she'd vomited during the final climb, the overwhelming fear that had threatened to paralyze her. But it also allowed her to examine the experience analytically, to extract lessons that transcended the specific circumstances. She wrote about the importance of taking inventory of resources during crisis. She explored the necessity of maintaining routine and structure when everything else is chaotic. She discussed the balance between acceptance and action, accepting the reality of a bad situation while refusing to accept that the situation is permanent and unchangeable. The book found a publisher in early 2020 with a tentative release date scheduled for September. Grace poured her evenings and weekends into revisions, working with an editor who understood her vision for something that was part memoir, part self-help, part educational resource. Lily, now finishing her junior year at the University of Kentucky, read the draft chapters and provided feedback. "Mom, this is really good. It's not just about the cave. It's about how to survive anything. Every teenager needs to read this." The comment made Grace smile. If she could help even a handful of students navigate their darkest moments, if her suffering could be transformed into something that prevented others from giving up, then perhaps the whole terrible ordeal had a purpose beyond mere survival. The COVID-19 pandemic in spring 2020 added an unexpected resonance to Grace's message. When schools shifted to remote learning and students found themselves isolated in their homes, struggling with fear and uncertainty, her story of enduring isolation and maintaining hope in darkness took on new relevance. She recorded video messages for her students, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation while emphasizing the temporary nature of all crises. "I know this feels endless and overwhelming. I know you're scared and frustrated and tired of being trapped in circumstances beyond your control, but this will end. You will see your friends again. Life will return to something approaching normal. The question is, how will you navigate this dark passage? What strategies will you use to maintain your mental health and your sense of purpose? Remember, problems have solutions. We might not like the solutions, they might require patience and creativity, but they exist. We just have to be persistent enough to find them." Her publisher delayed the book release until March 2021, wanting to incorporate some reflections on the pandemic experience and how it paralleled elements of her cave ordeal. The expansion felt natural. Grace wrote a new chapter titled Collective Darkness that explored how societies navigate shared trauma, drawing connections between her individual survival and the communal effort required to endure a global crisis. When Teaching in the Dark finally released, it found an audience hungry for messages of resilience and hope. The book climbed bestseller lists in the education and self-help categories, and Grace began receiving speaking invitations from schools, conferences, and organizations across the country. By the fall of 2021, 3 years after her rescue, Grace Donovan had become something she'd never anticipated: a public figure and motivational speaker. She balanced this new role with her primary identity as a classroom teacher, refusing numerous offers that would have required leaving Jefferson High permanently. "I'm a teacher first," she told one particularly persistent speakers bureau. "The public appearances matter because they let me share lessons that might help people, but my students matter more. They're the reason I fought to survive, so I could come back and teach them. I'm not abandoning that commitment just because there's money in telling my story to corporate audiences." She did accept selected speaking engagements during summer breaks and weekends. Grace spoke at education conferences about fostering resilience in students, at outdoor recreation expos about wilderness safety, at mental health symposiums about trauma recovery. Each appearance felt purposeful, an opportunity to transform her suffering into something meaningful. She donated significant portions of her speaking fees to organizations supporting cave conservation and search and rescue operations. The Kentucky Cave Rescue Network received a particularly large donation, along with her time as a volunteer consultant, helping train rescue teams in navigation techniques and survival psychology. The cave itself continued to call to her in complicated ways. Grace thought about it often, dreamed about it regularly, and felt an odd sense of connection to the stone passages that had nearly killed her. In the summer of 2022, she made a decision that surprised even Dr. Chen. She wanted to enter crystal caverns again, to walk through the modified tourist passages and confront the environment directly. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Dr. Chen asked during their session. "We've made tremendous progress, but deliberate exposure could trigger significant psychological distress." Grace nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I can't spend the rest of my life afraid of caves. They were my profession before they became my prison. I need to reclaim that relationship, to separate the specific trauma from the general environment." The Park Service arranged a private after-hours tour. Grace entered the cave on a July evening, accompanied by Lily, Tom Blackwood, and Dr. Chen as support. The aluminum staircase felt surreal beneath her feet, so familiar, yet charged with emotional weight. When the cool cave air washed over her face, Grace felt her heart rate spike and her breathing quicken. She paused, using the techniques she'd practiced, acknowledging the fear without letting it control her. Slowly, deliberately, she descended into the darkness. The main chamber opened around her, spectacular and alien, and strangely beautiful. Tom's LED lantern illuminated the flowstone formations she'd photographed 3 years earlier, before the earthquake, before the collapse, before everything changed. They didn't go far, just far enough for Grace to stand in the cave environment and survive the experience without panic. After 15 minutes, she was ready to return to the surface. But those 15 minutes represented a reclamation of agency, a demonstration that the cave no longer controlled her fear response. As they climbed back toward daylight, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The trauma would always be part of her history, but it no longer defined her present. She'd entered the darkness voluntarily and emerged by choice rather than desperate necessity. That simple fact represented profound healing. Jefferson High School held a special assembly in October 2022, marking the 4th anniversary of Grace's ordeal. Students had organized the event as a surprise, filling the auditorium with presentations about resilience, displays showing the cave map and survival techniques, and a video compilation of testimonials from current and former students describing how Grace's story had impacted their lives. Alex, the student who'd struggled with depression, spoke about how their conversation had helped provide perspective during dark times. A student named Carmen described using Grace's problem-solving framework during a family crisis. Another student, Jordan, explained how the book had helped him navigate the isolation of the pandemic. Grace sat in the audience wiping away tears, overwhelmed by the evidence that her suffering had generated so much positive impact. The assembly concluded with Lily taking the stage. "My mom hates being called a hero. She insists she just did what anyone would do, that survival is instinctive, that she got lucky. But I want to tell you what I saw when she came out of that cave, not the emaciated body or the trauma or the damage. I saw someone who'd faced impossible circumstances and refused to quit. Someone who'd literally crawled through miles of darkness to get back to the people she loved. Someone who'd turned a nightmare into a teaching opportunity. That's not instinct, and it's not luck. That's character. That's who my mom has always been, which is why I never doubted she'd find a way to survive. Grace Donovan, the teacher who wouldn't quit. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes, students and faculty on their feet, and Grace finally accepted what everyone else had recognized long ago. She was, in fact, a hero, whether she liked the label or not. In the years since, Grace has continued teaching, writing, and speaking. She published a second book in 2023 titled Problem Solving in the Dark, A Teacher's Guide to Critical Thinking, which became required reading in several education programs. She served as a consultant for documentary projects about cave systems and survival psychology. She testified before the Kentucky State Legislature, advocating for improved wilderness safety regulations and funding for search and rescue operations. Through it all, she remained Miss Donovan to her students at Jefferson High, the biology teacher who brought in fossils and told stories and pushed them to think critically and never accept easy answers. The ultimate measure of her impact, Grace believes, isn't in book sales or speaking fees or media attention. It's in the messages she receives from students years after they've left her classroom. The college graduate who credits her problem-solving framework for completing a difficult thesis. The young adult who used her resilient strategies to overcome addiction. The teacher who was inspired to enter the profession after reading her story. Each message represents a life touched, a dark passage navigated, a problem solved through persistence and creativity and refusal to quit. That's the legacy Grace Donovan has built from 22 days in absolute darkness. Not just a story of personal survival, but a framework for helping others survive their own impossible circumstances. On quiet evenings, she sometimes opens her field journal to the final entry, written on day 17 before she left her base camp to follow the stream. The handwriting is barely legible, the words wandering across the page in evidence of her deteriorated condition. But the message remains clear. If you're reading this and I didn't make it, please tell Lily I fought as hard as I could. Tell my students to never stop asking questions, never stop looking for solutions, never quit on problems that matter, and tell them that their teacher's last thoughts were about them, about getting back to room 214 and showing them that everything we learn in biology class applies to real survival. The body is amazing. The human will is stronger. I hope I proved that. She proved it day after day, chalk mark after chalk mark, one hard-won breath at a time in the darkness beneath the Kentucky hills.